Hey guys, it's Chef Andrea here, and I am so excited to be with you today to talk about one of my favorite things ever, which is flour. What kind of weird thing to make your favorite thing ever? Let's be real. My favorite thing ever is coffee. We all know that. But I am a bread baker at heart, and I will say that of my favorite things to do at home and to share here at A Chef's Cooking Studio is bread baking. So it's hard to be in love with bread baking and not be in love with flour, right? So today, let's talk a little bit about flour. I want to talk about all-purpose flour, bread flour, the differences between them, and what you should be looking for at the grocery store. All right, so that's what we're going to do today with Q&A with Chef A. Let's talk about flour. All right, kids, we're going to talk flour, one of my favorite things. Actually, I think this Q&A request came in from Chris in Nebraska. Wanted to know a little bit about flour varietals, and I was more than happy to accommodate that request because this is one of my favorite topics. And we talk about flour varietals here. We do a lot of bread baking series here at A Chef's Cooking Studio. We do a 4-week series that I consider kind of our intro into some really lovely breads that you will make again and again at home. Each week kind of builds on itself, meaning that week one, we start with AP flour, water, yeast, and salt. The next week, we introduce a few more ingredients. The next week, we try a few more ingredients. So the next week, we do a rye flour. So we introduce some rye, and we also introduce a few little softeners for the dough. The next week, we do a brioche. So we bring in eggs and butter and work in a more enriched dough. And then the final week, we do bagels, which is really fun because that requires an extra step that most breads do not, which is boiling the dough. So let's talk a little bit about the types of flour that we use. When you take a baking class with me that is not by its title flour specific, then I'm using all-purpose flour. And what I mean by that is if you come to take a rye bread class with me, we're going to have some level of rye flour introduced into that recipe. If you come to take my mind just went blank. What would be another example? Rye bread. If you come to take a whole wheat loaf course with me, a multi-grain course with me, we're going to have other flours and other grains introduced. But if you just come take baguettes, pasta, croissants, just basic biscuits, just basic baking classes with me, what I'm always going to be working with is all-purpose flour. Now, the all-purpose flour that I prefer to use, I am a little brand specific or brand loyal, and the brand that I like is King Arthur. So this is King Arthur AP flour, but it's a 12-pound bag, so I'm not picking that up. Let me grab something smaller. This is also King Arthur, so you can see that logo. I wouldn't worry about that at the moment. Just worry about that. So King Arthur, that's the logo. And we'll talk about these other varietals. And here, where we live in Florida, King Arthur is available pretty much at every grocery store. Walmart carries King Arthur. I'm trying to think who else carries King Arthur. Walmart, Publix. I believe Winn-Dixie does too down here. But of course, King Arthur has a really lovely website, and you can order any of their flours online. And they also have all kinds of specialty flours and baking items and things like that that are really fun too. So those are all things to consider. But all-purpose flour, this is my starting point for everything. I love to use all-purpose flour in biscuits classes because people say, wait a minute, I thought I had to have some specialty flour for biscuits. And nope, you do not. All-purpose is just what it sounds like. To me, it is the most all-purpose of all flours available. It will do anything for us. And but now let's talk about what changes up an all-purpose flour to something else, okay? So then I teach people how to make baguettes, and I pull out the all-purpose flour, and they say, wait a minute, I thought I needed bread flour to make bread. Okay, so bread flour. Here's the thing about flour. After we start out at all-purpose, this is to me the middle of the road. This is where it all begins. As I add more gluten, more protein to my all-purpose flour, I will start to change the protein to carbohydrate content slightly. And as the protein gets higher and higher, I will be able, as a manufacturer, to start to rename those flours with higher proteins as other types of flour. So all-purpose flour plus extra protein becomes bread flour. Let's go the reverse. All-purpose flour. I'm going to remove some of the protein, and now we're going to have a slightly softer flour, and we're going to make something we're going to label cake flour. Okay, so we started all-purpose, and then we're going to move ourselves in varying directions depending on how much protein we add to or take away from. How do we take protein away from flour? Okay, so as a manufacturer, for every 1 pound of wheat flour that I put into a bag, I remove so many ounces and replace it with a low protein option. That often can come in the form of some sort of starch. It can come from wheat starch, where they've literally extracted the protein from the wheat, isolated it, and extracted it out. And so now there's just completely protein-free ground wheat that's going into the all-purpose flour and turning it into a lower protein flour, which works better for cakes. I can take that extracted protein, and now add that back to, in a higher number, an all-purpose flour. So for every pound of all-purpose flour that's got a basic protein-carbohydrate ratio, I throw in additional protein, and now I move that into the category of bread flour, and so I can relabel it. So when you see differentials between flour spinning off of all-purpose flour, almost without exception, what's happened is that we've been dumbing down the protein in one direction or increasing it in another. And labeling will just depend really on the manufacturer. I will say that I don't know that there's any actual rule as to how much additional protein creates a bread flour, how much less protein creates a cake flour. I don't know that there's like a true standard. I imagine that's why there's different brands and you can try various ones. Why would I take the protein out of the flour? Why would I add more protein to the flour? That is a bigger question. What protein provides in flour for us is structure. It is what provides texture. The more protein that we have in the flour, the stronger, denser, chewier the texture of the final baked good will be. The less protein I have in the flour, the lighter, spongier, and airier the baked product will be. So if I remove some protein, I get a little bit softer final bake, and that's lovely for something like a cake. If I add protein, I get density and texture, and that's nice for something like an artisanal baguette, right? We're looking for a big crusty bread. We want it to have a lot of chew, even just a really hearty sandwich bread. I'm going to slice it and stack it with roast beef and Swiss cheese. I want something that'll hold together, right? So the more protein I add, the more texture, meaning structure. The integrity of the bread doesn't fall apart. It's not crumbly. It's light. It's dense and chewy. You can sink your teeth into it. The more protein, the more texture. When we come back down the other scale, the less protein, the lighter we go. So I'm going to do a couple of more recordings for you guys. I'm going to do one that is notes on a scandal. No, notes on carbs, which are so scandalous, aren't they? So take a look at my kind of deep dive into the carbohydrate discussion, because within that we'll talk about the carbohydrates versus the proteins that are found in these flours, and where we start to drift into some labeling that we're starting to see on flours, where the manufacturer is suggesting to us that this flour has a carbohydrate protein ratio that works for specific diet requirements, like our keto flour that's behind us, okay? So that's going to be in the carb story. And then join me for a short rundown on the gluten glory. And I've called it gluten glory because as a bread baker, gluten is one of my closest, dearest friends. It is all about the gluten when we get into the development of texture. And the short story is that the protein I've been talking to you about for the last 10 minutes, the proteins that we extract and get out of lighter flours like cake flour, that extracted protein that gets isolated and added into all-purpose flour to up the protein ratio. The protein that I'm referring to, by the way, is gluten. And so let's have a little gluten chat in my Gluten Glory video. But if you are wanting to do some baking at home and every recipe you see is calling for specialty flours, bread flours, keto flours, et cetera, barring a specific grain. Whole wheat bread wants some whole wheat flour. Rye bread needs some level of rye flour. But if you're just looking at a recipe that's just making a loaf of white bread, I always start with AP. And by the way, all-purpose AP flour. I also use it for pasta from scratch. I know that you can get a very different texture with Italian imported Semolita Durham wheat flour, but boy, you can get some beautiful fettuccine with all-purpose flour too. So I'm a big fan of all-purpose. I recommend it as a starting point. If you're just going to knock out your first loaf of bread at home, or you haven't baked in a few years and you're thinking about getting on board, start with AP. I think it's the safety net. It's what I use for everything here until we branch out into more specialty items. So all-purpose flour. By the way, I do love King Arthur. If you cannot find it, my next favorite to bake with is the brand Gold Medal. And then barring that, just find brands that work for you. Try a few of them. There are a few big box brands, like big mainstream brands, that I actually have not had much success with. So I've learned over time that there's a few that I really love. But King Arthur has a website. As I said, it's available at all the grocery stores here, including big box stores. And actually, our Costco has started selling these 12-pound bags of flour, which is pretty amazing. So, and you think you can't get through a 12-pound bag of flour, wait till you start baking homemade bread. All right, guys, so all-purpose flour. That's where I want you to start. That's the AP story. More protein, bread flour. Does bread flour make bread? All kinds of flour makes bread. Bread flour just makes a stretchier, denser, higher protein bread. All-purpose flour, cake flour. Can I make cake with all-purpose flour? You can, and you can actually look up on the internet, how do I substitute all-purpose flour for cake flour? And it'll give you a formula where you can just remove, let's say, a tablespoon of the flour from a cup of flour and replace it with a tablespoon of cornstarch, for example, that's gluten-free, protein-free. So there are ways to do that too. Start with your AP flour. Put in the comments below what brands that you love, what you've tried, and join me here again in a few minutes, and let's get talking about carbs. Let's get talking about gluten. Let's get down and dirty with this flour discussion, and we'll talk about specialty flours, nut flours, etc. Okay, that's it for this. Looking forward to seeing you guys soon. Thanks for joining me with Q&A with Chef A. Have a delicious day.